Okay, Boker Tov. Okay, so today's daf is it's Chaftalit again. We're a little bit ahead, and we pick up on Chaftal Amud Aleph, about 8 lines, 10 lines from the bottom, the two dots, with Truma, Init, etc. So here's another difference: that on Truma, if one hand becomes Tamei, the other does not. Whereby Kodesh, if one hand becomes Tamei, the other does. Now, I'll just mention right at the outset that there's an interesting debate between Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi assumes what it means is, remember, if your hand is Tamei, it's only your hand. That means you touch something that's a rabbinic tuma that makes your hand a sheni. Now, presumably you wash both hands because your hands in general are considered sheni. But you went ahead and you washed both hands and you were watching them and making sure that they didn't touch anything. So they were tahor, and then one hand, lo and behold, touches something that's a rabbinic problem, so that becomes a sheni. So how does the other hand become a sheni by kodesh? So Rashi says it means if hand one touches hand two. Normally they can't do anything because hand one is a sheni, and a sheni can't make your other hand into a sheni. And the chiddush is that by kodesh it can, but only if it touches it. Tosfos goes so far to say that no, by kodesh it's automatic. As soon as one hand becomes tamei, we consider both hands tamei. Okay, so that's just a basic debate in terms of what the Mishnah means, that it says by kodesh, one hand tamei makes the other hand tamei. But that's by kodesh and not by truma. So let's see what the Gemara says. We're only talking about when it is in connection. But not in connection, no. Now, what does this idea mean in connection? Again, there are two versions of it. Tosfos has, and I don't know where my markers are. Tosfos has that the two versions, I'll get my markers, are, excuse me. So according to Tosfos, here's the thing that is going to make you tamei, okay? Here's you, okay? Here's you, okay? So what's chiburin? So according to Tosfos, what chiburin means is this hand is touching it, okay? And then at the same time that hand is touching it, a classic example of something that'll make you tamei, ironically, is Sifrei Kodesh. So here's your Sefer Torah. Very ironic, but that's the example Tosfos uses. Okay, here's your Sefer Torah. This hand is touching it, so that hand becomes a sheni. Okay, that's a two, a sheni. And then this hand is touching that hand, or touching, and therefore that hand also, because it's like in connection, right? It's sort of electricity. So although it's not directly touching the thing, so that's chiburin, so that hand also becomes a sheni. That's Tosfos' version of chiburin. All right? So they're in connection, as opposed to saying that even just because one hand touches and then the other, and then it'll, and then that makes it, only when they're in connection. Rashi has it the opposite. Rashi has it that here, your hand is a, hold on, let me just pick Rashi. Right. Rashi has it like this. It's going the opposite direction. Here is your kodesh, okay, whatever it'll be. I don't know. Here's your oil that you're going to bring to the base of mikdash. Okay. Here's your tahor hand touching it, the kodesh, and here is your tamei hand touching your kodesh, touching your tahor hand. So this is what is tamei, and it is through indirectly transferring it to your tahor hand, tamei to your tahor hand to the kodesh. Okay, so for Tosfos, the issue is the tamei is bringing it to the tahor hand. For Tosfos, it's how it's becoming it's tamei. Your one hand touches the thing that causes tuma, that transfers it to the other hand if they're touching. For Rashi, it's how it's transferring the tuma. Your tar hand is touching the kodesh, the tar thing, but the tamei hand transfers it to the kodesh. Okay, but either way, that's pretty clear what's going on there. But anyway, it only works through some type of electricity. Either the way it receives the tuma is if one is touching the other, or the way it transfers the tuma if one is touching the other. Okay, so that's the issue of chiburin. If it is not through that, if they're separate, then the tuma is not going to transfer from one hand to the other, either be received by it or transfer through it to the other thing. So the Gemara says, Esvei, Abaye, so Abaye asked on this, Yad Guva, Mitami Chaverta, Latami Lakodesh, Avalo Truma. If you have a hand that is dry, then it makes it, even if it's dry is the point, because if it's wet, when something is wet and something, a sheni touches it, then the wet thing becomes a rishon, and that just makes it's much easier to transfer truma if something is wet. So here the point is it's not wet. If it's wet, it could work even maybe for truma and for chulin. It's dry. Okay, so even if it's dry, Matami Chaverto, Latami Lakodesh, it makes the other hand tameh to make kodesh tameh, avalo truma, not for truma. Divrei Rebbe. Right? So that's more or less what we said. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says, Lifsol avalo tameh. It only makes it pasul, it doesn't make it tameh. So when it makes the kodesh invalid, right, here's the point. The kodesh is your hand is a sheni. Okay, that's the idea. So if your sheni was going to come into contact with kodesh, right, it would make kodesh into a shlishi. Now that's considered litameh, because as we know, kodesh can pass that on one degree further to a revi. That's called litameh. To call it pasul means it ends. It would only make it into a revi. So his point is that he actually is that he says so when it makes the kodesh tameh, it doesn't make it a shlishi. It essentially makes it only a revi, even with this idea that one hand is matami the other. Avalo tameh. Okay, so we'll get back to that in a minute. Now, if you're telling me that the hands are not like directly in touching one, touching the other thing, so it's all this like everything all direct. I understand the chiddush that it's dry, because if it's not this is touched, right? If it's not like here, a little more. Let's take Rav Tosas' example. Maybe it's easier. Here's my sefer, which causes truma, believe it or not. Okay, so here one hand touches it. Okay, and here the other touches that. Okay, so if the idea is bechiburim, then presumably the logic is not that I say this hand. Here's the different conceptual logic. If first I touch this and my hand becomes a sheni, and then I say that by just touching my other hand, even when they're not sort of directly all in contact at the same time, this becomes a sheni. Then the conceptual logic you're using is that it transfers, right? This is tameh, and it transfers like tuma normally transfers. Well, normally we wouldn't have a sheni making something else into a sheni. You would need liquid or whatever in order to make it one hand make the other tameh. That's a big chiddush. That even if this is dry, this hand as a sheni can make this other hand into a sheni. That's a big chiddush.
Oh, yes.
And therefore you have to say, even if it's dry, it can do that. Okay, but what's the logic if I say, you know what, this will never do anything. This doesn't do anything. Okay, but if you've got it going like this, then this hand becomes tameh. So then the logic is not that this is tameh and it makes this tameh. The logic is that it seemed like I am touching this, right, in extension, correct? You see that? If I demand that it only works in this context, then it's not really this is making this tameh. It's like this is indirectly touching it. Whether it's receiving the tumah, like Tosa says, or transferring the tumah onto the other thing, it's working as one big extended thing. So the Gemara says, if that's what you limit your case to, when they're in direct touching one, touching the other, then there's no chiddush that's saying that this is dry, because the logic is not that this made this tameh. The logic is that this is indirectly touching the other thing. So why do you have to say dry if we're limiting ourselves to a case of bichiburin? So let's read that. So if one makes the other tameh, independently, when they're not all directly in sort of like, all touching the thing, then you have to tell me even if it's dry, because normally that wouldn't be able to happen. But if you just tell me that it's only if it's while it's sort of in direct, sort of A touching B touching C, so my Rabbi says in a gufa, then it's not based about the normal idea of the hand transferring to the other hand. It's all like an extended way of touching. So then why do you have to tell me, even if it's dry? If there's no chiddush in that, conceptually it's a completely different point. Okay, so that's the Gemara's challenge. So that idea that limits it to this case of indirect touching. Itmar Nami was also taught. Now there's a whole question of what the Nami means, because this next thing we're going to teach does not seem to be directly supporting what we just said. But anyway, it's certainly relevant, right? But let's take a look. Reish Lakish said, Reish Lakish, Lo Shanu Ella Yado Aval Yado, Aval Yad Chavero Lo. It's only when it is. Here's another interesting thing. I am touching, my one hand is tamei, is touching David's hand there, that's tahor. Does that also work? Or does it only by kodesh, or is it only when my left hand touches my right hand? Let's say I touch somebody else's hand. So Reish Lakish says, only when you touch your own hand. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, echad yado v'echad yad chavero. Even if you touch somebody else's hand, by kodesh, one hand can make another hand tamei. But also hayad lifso, avolo tamei. Now, and that is also hayad. Okay, meaning now what also hayad means is here my left hand became tamei. That made boom my right hand tamei, right? Because it's kodesh. So Rabbi Yochanan says, this hand, this left hand, can go make David's hand tamei. This is the real thing that's tamei. But this right hand that became tamei because of the left, that's already just like an extended. It's 1 degree removed. So even though this is a sheni and it made this into a sheni, this cannot make somebody else's hand tamei. Okay, you got it. This is the real thing that's tamei. Right. This is the real thing that's tamei. Because of the mile of a kodesh, we allow it to make the other hand tamei. But this other hand now can't continue that on. Okay, but this, the original one, says Rabbi Yochanan, not only can make your own hand tamei, it can make somebody else's hand tamei as well. Okay, so there's 2 points. One is the power is only invested in the original hand. But the second point, which makes a lot of sense, we won't belabor that. But the second point, the real debate of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is that Rabbi Yochanan says this hand can even make somebody else's hand tamei. Okay, so we're going to look at that in a minute, but that's just right now the immediate debate. So avalola tamei. And now the other point that we said earlier, we quoted that says that even when this can make kodesh, the matame kodesh, and it's a sheni, it doesn't make kodesh into a shlishi. The fact it really, this idea that now this other hand has become tamei, that only makes kodesh into a revi. It's posel kodesh. It's not matame kodesh. Okay. Now ma midiktani seifa. So where do you get this? Because it says at the end, shayad matame chaverta lekodesh avolo letruma. Where do you get the idea that it only is posel, it's not matame? Maybe if the other hand becomes a sheni as well, it can make truma, it can make kodesh into a shlishi. No, because the end of the Mishnah said, it repeated the idea. The Mishnah said, because one hand is matame, its friend, its other hand for kodesh, but not for truma. Hasulamali, hatamale reisha. So that's repeating what it initially said. It said the difference is that one hand is matame, another, for kodesh and not for truma. And then it's repeated it. Why did it repeat it in the Mishnah? I'm sorry. So this is not the idea of lisa below tummy. This is where does Rabbi Yochanan get the idea that it can be matame even somebody else's hand? Because the Mishnah repeated the idea that one hand is matame, another for kodesh. So why does it have to repeat it? To tell you that not only the reason it repeated that one hand can make another hand tamei is to tell you not only can it make your other hand tamei, it can make somebody else's other hand tamei. The Reish Lakish Rabbi, and even Reish Lakish retracted and wound up agreeing with Rabbi Yochanan that one hand can make another hand tamei. How do you know it? Reish Lakish Rabbi. I'm Rabbi Yonah, I'm Rabbi Ami, I'm Reish Lakish. Echad yado, echad yad chavero. Whether your hand or even somebody else's hand, it can make somebody else's hands tamei. But also hayad, only the original hand can make yours or somebody else's tamei. It can't, a derivative hand can't do it. And live solo avalola tamei. And again, only to make kodesh into a revi, to passel kodesh, not to make it into a. So what we have here is introduced, number one, the idea that this power to make another hand tamei is limited to the original hand, which makes sense. But also this interesting debate of what can it do? Can it do this to your friend's hand? Now, what does this have to do with the previous issue? So Tosfos says, let me just check Tosfos. I know that's actually not exactly what I wanted to say. So the interesting question to ask is the debate of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about somebody else's hand tied into this issue of the idea of what do you call it? Of the idea of this extended touch, because there was an approach that wanted to limit the idea of one hand being the tamei of the other, not when it just exists independently. This became tamei, now this touches this. but only when they're sort of, in conducting electricity, one touching the other thing. So the Gemara doesn't directly connect it, but it's certainly suggestive to think that it's a related debate. If this hand can go ahead and be matame somebody else's, right? If they're both my hands, right? If I'm going ahead and the only way this hand is going to become tameh is if this is touching the tumah and this is touching this, because that's like conceptually is an idea of an extended touch. It makes a lot more sense to speak about a type of an extended touch when they're both my hands, right? If one is yours and one is mine, I mean, you could talk about it, but there are two different agents involved. It's harder to think about it as an extended touch. So this type, if you limit it to this case when it's all in the same act, then it makes more sense that they're both my hands. But if you say that even when they're not in the same act, this became tameh, now this can touch this and make this tameh, then it's pretty much just as logical, the same way it can make this tameh, that it can make your hand tameh as well. Right? So this debate of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara doesn't exactly connect the dots, but whether it can make somebody else's hand or only your own could somewhat be made similar to this question of, of what do you call it, about whether you're limiting it to a case of like only when A is touching B, touching C, only an extension, or even when they're separate moments. Okay, that's one way you can see of some correlation. Another way, and this is what Tosfos points out about a possible correlation, is does the second hand that become tameh, does that make Kodesh into a shlishi or into a revi? Okay, and Tosfos says the same point. If I am saying that the way it happens is it's going like this, then it's sort of like, if this is the only case that it works, then it's sort of like this directly touched the Kodesh. This directly touched either the Kodesh or the Tumah. Because the whole idea is we see it as a form of extended touch. No, so that's the question, is that might only be according to Rabbi Yochanan. So if you say that you see that you limit it, like that this is the only case that it works, then conceptually that's because it's like this directly touched. So if it's because this directly touched, maybe it works just as powerfully as the original hand. Whereas if you say that it goes in separate steps, this becomes tameh and then it touches this and this becomes tameh, then conceptually this is a derivative. So and therefore it doesn't have the same power, the same strength as the original hand. Okay, so there are these three different issues. Number one, is it only, the basic issue is what's the fundamental case? Separate moments, touching this and transferring it, or one extended process? And that debate could impact two other debates. Number one is what's the story about a friend's hand? Friend's hand makes sense if it's separate moments, doesn't make sense if you're seeing it as an extended act, not as much. And what's the power of the second hand? Is it equal to the first or is it derivative? And that could also be, if it's like this, it's probably equal to the first. If it's like this, separate moments, then it's probably weaker than the first hand. Yes, Michael.
All I was going to say is that to say that it's conceptually, that they're separate hands, it doesn't really make so much sense, because if I touch a shirt, it's not like I say that finger's something and not the rest of me, right?
Yeah, well, the whole point is that rabbinically you have to accept the idea that just the hand can become tameh. But once you do, then you work within that system. Okay, so now let's take a look. The Gemara says like this. Right. So in the end, right, Reb Yochanan, who says, right, notice that when Reish Lakish comes around to Reb Yochanan's idea, he says two things. First, it says when it says Af Reish Lakish Harder Beit, Amar Yonam Rabban and Reish Lakish Echad Yado V'Echad Yad Chavero. So he comes around to Reb Yochanan's idea that it could be matami somebody else's hand, but also hayad, and it's only the original has that power. Lifso lavalol tamei, that when he says it could do somebody else's hand, that he also says that the second hand is what is derivative and weaker, right? So those are linked ideas. If it can do somebody else's hand, then it means it's not looking at it as an extended act, okay? And once that's true, then it means that the second hand is going to be weaker than the first, and only lifso avalol tamei. And now the Gemara questions this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess it's implicit in the way you're describing it. Maybe you even said it's really like electricity.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
It's really like amazing.
Right.
No,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The lifso avalol tamei tanahi. Now this issue about the power of the second hand, is it like the first and can be matame kodesh or only derivative and make kodesh pasul? That's a debate of Tanaya. Now we talk in the Mishnah. Kol apostle b'truma matame yadayim liyoshniyot. Anything that invalidates truma, okay, meaning that's a sheni, so can also make the hands into a sheni. That's the idea of, let's say, we gave an example of like sifrei kodesh. The yad matame chaverta. On one hand makes another hand tamei. Di Rabbi Yoshua. The chachamim omim Yadayim Shnia saying, and the Chachamim saying, no, your hands are a sheni. If they either you're not paying attention to them or they touch something that's tamei, that's a sheni. Vein sheni osa sheni, and one hand is a sheni, can't make the other hand into a sheni. So it sounds like the Chachamim here disagree with this idea that by Kodesh, one hand is matami the other.
This is a machloket, the ain sheni osa sheni.
No, it's a machlokas whether one hand can be matami the other.
Everybody holds it ain sheni.
As a general rule. That's
general
why
rule.
this idea of one hand being matami the other is limited to Kodesh. So the Gemara says, my love, sheni hu delo avid, hashlishi avid. So the Gemara doesn't want to think that the Chachamim disagree with the basic rule of our Mishnah that one hand is matami the other. So it says, okay, here's what they're saying. One hand doesn't make the other into a sheni, but it would make the other into a shlishi, which means that the second hand can be posel kodesh, but not matami, which is that idea of derivative, okay? So isn't that exactly the debate? That according to Rabbi Yoshua, the second hand has the same power, it's a sheni, and according to the Chachamim, the second hand is a shlishi. So the Gemara says, no, Dilma lo sheni avid lo shlishi. Maybe not. Maybe the Chachamim completely reject the idea that one hand is matami the other. They're not just saying it's weaker, they're saying it doesn't work. So the Gemara says, Elafan. That maybe that's not the debate whether the second hand is a sheni or shlishi, but let's try this. Hihani tanai, the following tonight. The Tanya we've done the brisa. Yad neguva matami chaverta. This is what we start quoted on the Amud Aleph. Even if the hand is dry, it's matami the other one. Latami bakodesh avalo litruma. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, and it makes the second hand tamei that it can that the second hand can make kodesh tamei. But it won't affect truma. This is all in by kodesh. But the phrase it uses is litame bakodesh, to make kodesh tamei, which means the second hand is considered a sheni and makes kodesh a shlishi. And then the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, osu yav lifsol avalo tamei. No, it can only make it can only make kodesh into a revi. It cannot make it into a shlishi. The second hand goes down a level. Is a shlishi.
Doesn't have enough power.
Doesn't have enough power. So we have these again 3 debates. Number 1 is what's the story about somebody else's hand. Number 2 is what is the second hand have the same level? Is it a sheni or does it go down? Is it a shlishi? And then we have the debate of is it only when it's in connecting and sort of like electricity or separate acts. And the first 2 debates seem dependent on the second. If it's only in electricity, it makes sense that it's all both your hands and that then the hands have the same level because it's all an extended act. If it's not in electricity, separate acts, then it's really transferring it. And then it makes sense it could transfer to a friend's hand, and it makes sense that the second hand would be a derivative, would be a shlishi, not a sheni. Okay, yeah.
If it's the first possibility in this last point, where it's only when they're touching.
Yeah.
When they stop touching, it goes back to the former state, or the tuma state remains?
No, then the tuma state remains. But the way it received the tuma state was in that moment of touching.
But it doesn't go back.
Correct. Okay. So getting down to some of the last ones. If you have food that has never come in contact with liquid, so it's not only that it's not tamei, it's not susceptible to becoming tamei. It's never been in contact with liquid since it's been, let's say, cut off the tree or the animal shechted and whatever and made into food. And therefore, it's even if something tamei touches it, it's not tamei. It needs to first come in contact with liquid. So nevertheless, so if it's truma, your hands could be tamei, no problem. The food is Teflon right now. But for kodesh, you still have to wash your hands. So let's see why. Pani with on brisa. Amar Rabbi Chanan ben Antignos. V'chiyeish miguva lekodesh. Now he says, I don't understand why this is even a chiddush that you have to wash your hands for kodesh in this case. By kodesh, there's no need for it to be wet in order to be susceptible. Being dry is a meaningless idea by kodesh. Why? We have a general principle that by kodesh, like if you've got your wine or oil that you're going to put in a klishares and bring to the Beis Hamikdash, etc., that the very fact that they have this holiness, that makes them more susceptible. That's like an idea that the holier something is, the more vulnerable and sensitive. So there's a general idea that kodesh can become tamei without being wet. So this isn't some new mala that's about washing your hands. The whole concept is of course it doesn't matter by kodesh if it's wet or dry. It's just as bad wet and dry. So there's not a chiddush here to even begin with. Okay, so what's this whole idea? Oh, even if it's dry, you have to wash your hands. that doesn't even, of course, that's irrelevant by Kodesh. So let's see what the Gemara says. Well, tzricha, here's the case. Kigon, shetachav lo chavero l'toch piv, o shetachav lo la'atzmo b'kush b'karkar. Okay, so you basically are going ahead and you have, your hands aren't washed, fine, but somebody put food, some Kodesh food into your mouth. There you are, you're going, or whatever you're biling, you're chewing your shlumin. You get around to washing your hands, but you either used a toothpick, you had some herring, that's a shlumin, no, that won't work. Anyway, you had some little cubes of meat from your shlumin. A toothpick is a kli eitz that doesn't have a base kibul, so it's totally tahor, it doesn't transfer tumah. So you put your toothpick in and you're chewing your shlumin meat. Okay, so even though your hands are sheni, no touching, or somebody else put the meat in your mouth, no touching, lukma, no hands, right? And then there are your chewing, and then you want to go ahead and, oh, you know what would go good with this meat? A little onion would go good with it. Ubikesh, lecho, tznon, ubatzel, shachulini mahem. And you go ahead and you want to go ahead and eat some onion and or some radish together with your meat. So you say, look, my hands are sheni, that's true. But I would never touch Kodesh with his hands, even dry Kodesh. Of course not. Whatever. The Kodesh is always susceptible. But somebody else put some nice shlomi meat in my mouth, and I hear some chopped up onions. Let me take some chopped up onions and chulin and throw that in my mouth. So who cares that my hand is a shame? These chopped up onions never got wet, are never susceptible to tumah, right? And let me therefore take these chopped up onions and they'll remain tahor and throw it in my mouth.
Onions are always, those things always, that doesn't count.
Yeah, their own sort of juice, it doesn't really count.
Oh.
Okay, fine. So can I do that? Okay. Iman, l'kodesh gazu ben rabbanan, l'chuma lo gazu ben rabbanan. So what would you think if I would say to you, Michael, can I do that? I'm chewing Kodesh. God forbid my hands should ever touch the meat in my mouth. Can I take a whole pile of onions, of chopped up onions, and throw it in my mouth? What would you tell me?
We're all getting so crazy over Kodesh. I'd say no.
Why not? What might happen?
Because
I'm throwing it in my mouth. Maybe I'll touch the meat in my mouth with my hands. Don't get your hands close to your mouth and feed yourself with your hands, right? If you've got that Kodesh meat in your mouth. Okay, so do we have to be concerned about that? So by Kodesh, we are concerned. Don't do that. But by Truma, if you're chewing Truma, then we would allow you to actually put the chulin in your mouth, and we wouldn't be afraid you would touch the Truma. So that's how we're framing the case. Not whether you have to wash your hands before handling Kodesh. That would be obvious. But that you're eating Kodesh, and you have to wash your hands before feeding yourself chulin if you've got Kodesh in your mouth. So for Kodesh you do, and for Truma you do not.
I just don't understand how anybody ate anything.
All right.
It's like,
Right. Last one is somebody who stopped to be, was an onain, had lost a relative, and now the relative is buried. And somebody who was not able to eat korbanot because he had to bring a final sacrifice to make him tahor, and now he's able to eat korbanot. So for Kodesh, he has to dunk in a mikvah before he can now ahead and eat korbanot, but not for truma. My timer. Why is that? So until now, somebody who was an onain and somebody who was mechusar kipparim could eat truma. The only thing is that an onain and mechusar kipparim cannot eat kodesh. So since until this moment they were in a state of forbidden to kodesh, and now they're changing their status. So to formally mark the new status, go into the mikvah. Now that, by the way, makes sense because the status of changes here outside of the person. The person stops being an onain because something outside of him changed. The person the dead person was buried. Somebody stops being a mechusar kipparim because something outside of him changed. A korban was brought in the Beis Hamikdash. But what happens as a result is his own personal status is now different. So to mark the change of your own personal status, we need something actually to do to your body. Go to the mikvah, and that'll formally mark the change of your status, and then you'll be able to eat kodesh. And that makes a lot of sense. So with that, we finish the 10 ma'alot, and we get to the next mission.
Yeah. So this thought is completely obvious. It never dawned upon me. There's something about the system. Like I could never eat truma.
Right.
But I can eat something which is even
higher
than
Good point.
It's an
Right.
interesting
Yeah, you're right.
phenomenon.
It is.
It's built into the system.
That's
I
an
can eat
interesting
kodesh,
point. Right.
but I could never eat truma.
Right. That's a
Kodesh
very
is
good
on a
point.
higher level.
Right. That's a
I
very
don't
good
know
point.
what that means,
Yeah.
but it's like really intriguing.
You're right. I hadn't sort of exactly framed it like that. It's an excellent point.
That's the
Yeah.
big code.
Because I can.
If he brings a shlamim, You can't eat a chatas or an asham, but if you bring your korban, you can eat the meat of your shlamim in Yerushalayim.
And that's kodesh.
Right.
But I can never eat truma.
Right.
Ever.
Right. Okay. Now we've done with all of the stratifications of different levels. A lot of this has been different levels of treating kodesh and truma, but there's also been implicit and explicit different levels of people based on which sort of class they're part of and which degrees they observe. And now we start getting to the transition of how actually we believe people that we normally wouldn't believe in under circumstances, particularly as it gets to the regel. But we're going to see even areas, even before the regel, where we're prepared to sort of do away with some of those distinctions.
Yes. I'm just trying to get my mind around just one thing. With the truma case, we weren't concerned if you're eating the dry, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
But don't you have saliva in your mouth? And
yeah, but we're not afraid that you'll touch with your hands, that your hands won't get into your mouth and touch the stuff that's in your mouth.
No, but your hands will touch the saliva within the time of the truma that's in your mouth.
I think we're not concerned about. You mean like even if it's
You said you put your fingers on your lips to put it in, but
but
the moment it touches your lips, it's all moist.
I'm not sure if saliva that has not been separated out of your mouth, it has a status of mashka. Have to double check that. Okay. All right. Chomer b'truma. Now, there's a stringency in truma. Sheb Yehuda. It's actually funny that it introduces it by Chomer b'truma, because really what it's going to introduce is a leniency. Okay, so let's take a look. Sheb Yehuda in Judea, which is where Jerusalem is, which is going to be relevant. That in general, and we've already seen this, that you'll trust people, even the Amei Haaretz, you trust them when it gets to issues about Kodesh. Like here's that irony again. The holier it is, but because you don't want to exclude them from the Beit HaMikdash, you trust them when it comes to the Tahara of Kodesh. So the purity of yayin and shemen, of wine and oil, those are the types of things that they would bring in vessels and that they could sanctify to bring for the Beis HaMikdash. So if they bring wine and oil, which is Kodesh, not said explicitly here, but assumed, then they're believed the whole year to say that they kept their Kodesh tahor for reasons that we've seen. Maybe they're more scrupulous, but more significantly, you don't want to cause them to be completely, marginalized and completely disenfranchised. So that you believe Kol Yemos Hashanah, the entire year. Now, in a way, this is Chomer b'truma, meaning, yes, I misstated. Chomer b'truma means a greater stringency of truma than Kodesh. That's what it means. I'm sorry. So Kodesh, here's the irony. Kodesh, you believe them the whole year. That's what we've said, right? Because otherwise they'll go and build their own Beis HaMikdash. They'll be completely, excluded. So Kodesh, you believe them to be careful the whole year if they bring stuff that they say is Kodesh. But Truma, you don't believe them the whole year. Okay, let them give their Truma to a Kohen Am Haaretz. That we've said before. So that's ironic, but Truma is more than Kodesh in terms of believing the Am Haaretz. However, even acknowledging that by Truma we generally don't believe them to keep it tahor, we do believe them a certain time of the year. What time of the year do we believe them? Ubishas hagitot v'abadim, the time of pressing of the olives and of pressing of the grapes, that's the gat, and pressing of the olives, it's the bod. Then when they're pressing it, af ala truma, they're producing their wine and oil, right? It's the time when they're harvesting in all the grapes and they're pressing it and producing their wine and oil. Then, and the Amaretz comes to a Kohen and says, I just harvested all my grapes, we made all this wine, here's your truma. And it's the time of when this activity is going on, then we believe them even for truma. During that season. Now, why do we believe them even for truma at that time? If in general, well, just give it to your friend, the Kohen Amaretz. Don't give it to me. I don't trust you. So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, 4 lines from the bottom, Ubishas hagitot uvabadim hakol matarim es keileihem. There, since everybody got into the process, like everybody goes out and bakes their matzah, everybody, the whole community knows it's time for the olive press. The first thing you do is you kasher all your kelim, like before Pesach, right? I'm going to have on the show a big, boiling thing of water. Everybody bring their kelim. I'm being a little funny because that's what you do at Pesach. But here, when you boiling water, but basically, this will be part of the communal experience when it comes time to do this. Once a year, when we begin the process, we all take all our stuff to the mikvah. Total, everything is tahor. We're going to process it. And that time you can assume that when the truma is produced at that time, right after they were metaheret, that it's going to be tahor and you can accept it. Now that is a practical reason why we could assume it's better. However, later Rashi says that there's also a little bit of a self-interest reason why we believe people at this time. Can you tell me what the self-interest reason
This
is?
is the main time of production.
Because you're to tell the Kohanim that they can't get 90% of the Truma, right? The Amei Aretz were a lot more numerous than the Chaverim. They probably also were the people that were much more involved in agriculture and business and so on than the Chaverim. So they're producing, let's say, 90% of the Truma. So you're going to tell me that the Kohanim, Chaverim have to be excluded from all of that? Oh, you know what? At the time when they're pressing the oil, then you can believe everybody. And that's when most of the Truma is going to get, produced and distributed. So Rashi, I'm not saying this later, Rashi says this. So there's some facts on the ground that allow us to say this because everybody is told of their vessels, but there are also certain policy issues. The same way there were policy issues by believing them when it comes to Kodesh, right? So there might be some facts on the ground that help us say it, but there's also like overriding policy considerations that create that tell us to believe them by Kodesh and to believe them by Truma at this time. Yes.
But still, why is it? If it's the same Yehuda, it applies elsewhere.
We're going to get to why Yehuda.
You can really total these things, and they're talking about like a got and stones.
Oh, the stone things don't become tummy. Things that are attached to the ground don't become tummy. It's the vessels that you put it in. Okay. All right. Now. Now this period has passed. And they bring to a Kohen, the Samarits brings to a Kohen a whole big barrel of wine. But you should have brought it to me a week ago. That was still the time of the pressing. Now I have to assume it's a week later. It's after the season. I have to assume it's Tameh. I can't accept your Truma. What am I going to do? So I can't accept it from you. Now I have to assume it's Tameh. Here's the irony. It was produced 3 weeks ago.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that because then it gets so confusing. What you got to like label everything exactly when it was produced. Whatever the way.
Checking the date.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? They didn't do that. Okay. What we'll do the old UPC symbols. We'll have everything tagged. No. So what they did was they said it based on the time that you are basically not the time it was produced, but the time you're getting it, meaning the time they're making the claim and giving to you, saying this is Tahor. If they say that during the right period, they're believed. During the wrong period, they're not believed. So here it goes. The guy brings it to me. He made it 3 weeks ago. Now he's bringing it to me. I can't take it. I can't believe you now. So what do? So you tell him, you know what? Do me a favor, please. Hold on to this and give it back to me next time, 10 months from now, when it's the next pressing.
The exact same
the
stuff.
exact same stuff. But then I'll be able to believe you. I can't believe you now. I can't take it now.
No sense.
Sim Amarlo, what can I tell you? You got to have some rules. Sim Amarlo, he frashki lutoka revius kodesh. But let's say what the Amar tells you is he says, you know what? This barrel of wine, before I brought this to you for Truma, from the same barrel, I took out like a little bottle, a little cup worth of wine that I sanctified for Kodesh, for Nesachim. So he says, oh, thank you, that's great. Now, since I believe you about the Kodesh that you separated out, and that I can believe you the whole year, by Kodesh, I can believe you now that the whole barrel was stuck with. Okay? So Neman, he's believed. Kadayain, maybe you also wonder if there's like a little wink and a nod. Like, I can't accept it now. Unless, of course, you were to take out some wine and sanctify it for Kodesh, then I would be able to accept it.
And pay you.
Well, no, you can't pay for Truma. Okay. So,
that's right.
Money. If you have barrels of wine and oil that are mixed, you're believed. Now, normally what mixed means is it means chulin and truma mixed, or that have never been separated out. So why you would be believed when it is not yet separated or had been mixed together after separated, but you wouldn't believe if it was truma, is not at all clear. So we're going to see about that in the Gemara. Now, here it says you are believed at the time of pressing. So maybe what it's saying is the same way you're believed on the truma, you're believed when it is pre-separated truma and it is miduma'a, okay, or it had truma that then got mixed up with glue. So it's the same time period that you would be believed about truma, the time of the pressing. The kodem would get those shuvim yom. What this also adds, and it's not clear if this also refers to the earlier point. It seems like it does not, that in this special case of being mixed, you're even believed 70 days prior to the actual pressing. Now, now it's possible that is going back to modify even the general air time of being believed, but it's interesting that it waited till here. Let's take a look at the Gemara.
Rabbi Linzer,
Yes.
what compels a Me'aretz to give truma other than religious integrity?
Religious integrity. It's not like they weren't from.
Exactly.
It's not, first of all, we have to correct some assumptions.
Right.
Number one is that they were ignorant. Okay.
Exactly.
Now they might have not been as scrupulous. They might have been. They might have sometimes rabbis assume that people in their audience, because they don't know how to read the Tosfos as well as they do, are less intelligent than them. People in their audience could be 10 times more intelligent than them. They just have never learned how to read the Tosfos. So number one is that they, educated, intelligent. They probably were wealthier than the rabbis, better in business, and all those types of things. They just either were not as informed about details of Tumah Tara, or weren't as scrupulous about details of Tumah Tara, maybe a little bit of both. That's basically the difference between the Amei Haaretz. Okay, so
we use
but
the
they had,
phrase Haaretz,
but they were totally from. They're from about Hilchos Shabbos. They're from about Hilchos Kashrus. They're from about this. They're from about that.
Really?
Now the areas that they weren't so scrupulous in was Tumah Tara, and the Gemara also assumes a certain percentage weren't as careful about separating out Trumas and Maasros. Now, why there? Again, we tend to sort of, I think, extend it from that and say, so in general, they're not from. They don't separate out Trumas and Maasros. But first of all, the Gemara said it was only a minority of them, number one. Number two, it says everybody was believed in Truma, to separate Truma, because that was a tiny amount. The question was, were they believed to separate out Maaseh, which was 20%. There were 2 Maasehs. So there, it says a minority of them, not a majority, were not believed. But one also imagines that there was a real serious financial aspect there, right? To give up 20% of your annual income, right? So to assume that because that there was concerns about them separating Meiser, and there was concerns about their scrupulousness by Tara, means that they were generally not observant or not from, I don't think is a legitimate. I don't think it's legitimate, right? So let's take a look now at the Gemara. Okay, Yehudaim begalil lo. So it's the same. Yehudaim begalil lo. So only in Judea do we have this greater leniency around Truma, not in the Galilee, and maybe also. And maybe not only about the Truma, maybe also about believing them, actually more what the Gemara is going to focus on, is believing them about Kodesh for the whole year. That's a special leniency by in Yehuda, not in the Galilee. Why? My time, or what's the reason? So because in the Galilee, Jerusalem isn't in the Galilee, it's in Judea, and the Galilee, there's a strip of land of Samaritans, halachically, as Eretz Ha'amin. It's just fascinating because it's in the boundaries of Eretz Israel, but because it is culturally not by, Jews or Samaritans, which were a whole question about their status, it's considered to essentially be non-Jewish territory. And therefore, the halacha is when you go into non-Jewish territory, usually it means outside of Israel, we consider the ground of Eretz Ha'amin tameh. Okay, and therefore, if you go there, you're tameh. If you were to bring truma or kodshim there, it would become tameh. So here's the thing. Why do we believe people about their kodesh, that it's tahor? Because to enable them to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, right? But if you made stuff kodesh in the Galio, there's no way you'd be able to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. So we have no impetus to believe that it's tahor, because either way, you're not going to be able to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. You could only get it there through transporting it through the Eretz Ha'amim, and that would make it tameh, right? And I forget what the B is. Anyway, there's no impetus for us to believe you in that case that it is tahor. Okay, so
even though you've been taking it on a wagon the whole way through, the moment it passes.
Exactly. So now the Gemara. So therefore, there's no reason to believe you by Kodesh because anyway, the whole reason we believe you is because it could be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, and we have to deal with the implications of that.
So how does someone from the Galilee bring anything into the Beis Hamikdash and come down to go up to Jerusalem and buy things there?
Basically, yeah, that would basically exactly.
It's not a problem for them to bring the Maser Sheni
like
that, right?
Yeah, but you bring the money and you buy your stuff.
So you can never actually bring the Maser Sheni?
That's what the Gemara is saying. That is correct. So let's take a look at what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, the Gemara will deal with, should there be some ways to transport it safely? So let's take a look. All right, that's a good question. Let's take a look. So the Gemara says, the Nesei, the shade of table mikdash. Why don't you bring it in a box? and a castle, but it means like a cabinet. Basically, you put it in something and you carry it, in a wagon, or you carry it in a box, and it never touches the ground. It's always suspended above the ground. So the Gemara says no. How many Rebbe he? It's Rebbe. The Amar Oel Zorik Lav Shmei Oel. A thrown Oel, an Oel that is not rooted in the ground, that's not on the ground, is not an Oel, right? Because if you've got Tuma here, and it's in a house, right? And here I am on the house, right? The Tumas mace, because Tumas Eretamim was like Tumas mace. It was considered that there were dead bodies buried there. So it hits the roof, it spreads throughout the house, but I'm safe, okay? But let's say, okay, I'm not in a house, I'm on a flying carpet, okay? That's my Oel Zarek. I'm on a flying carpet. So is that an Ohel? Does it stop the tumah and cause it to spread? Or is it not an Ohel because it's not rooted on the ground and the tumah goes through? Guess what we have as modern day flying carpet? Airplanes fly over cemeteries. Oel Zarek. Does it stop the tumah and cause it to spread or not? Or does it go through? So that's the case of here I am. I'm transferring my kodesh, my wine and oil, in Eretz Amim, and here I am. I'm walking with it, okay? And does it stop the tumah because it hits the bottom of the box, or this is suspended in air, right? So it doesn't stop the tumah, and it's going to be metamiyah. So Rebbe says a thrown ohel is not an ohel, and the tumah will hit me through the flying carpet, and it'll hit this even if I'm carrying it in a box. Okay, let's just read that. Right. So that was a bridge. A bridge isn't thrown. A bridge is ultimately rooted in the ground. Okay, right. I mean, it could have air underneath it. You could have like a tent or a canopy, but it's got to be, its base has to be connected to the ground.
The issue isn't whether it's open or closed.
No.
It's a
right. Exactly. If you had an umbrella, right, that was wreathed on the ground or whatever,
like at the beach,
that would be an ohel because it's connected to the ground, structurally connected to the ground.
Oh, that's why you can open a baby carriage on Shabbos.
Oh, I'm not going there. Okay. The Tanya, we turn to Brisa. You go, actually, you yourself get carried like in a box through the Eretz Ha'amim, suspended off the ground. Rebbe Metame, Rebbe says you're Tame. Rebbe Yehuda Metaher, you're Tahor. But according to Rebbe, it won't be able to transfer it. It says, why not bring it in a pottery vessel that is sealed with a airtight seal? Okay, when it's not airtight, literally, but whatever. When a tight seal, you remember, pottery vessels only become tamei through their airspace, right? Through where something gets into the tumah seems to go into the cavity. And if there is a tight seal on the opening of a pottery vessel, tumah can't get in from the outside and can't get in from the inside. The tight seal is seen as protecting the inside. So why not just bring it in a tightly sealed pottery vessel? So Amar Rebbe Elazar, shown him because we teach, Ein Kodesh Nitzo B'Tzamid Pasil, sanctified objects cannot be protected by this seal. This is another, it's another stringency. So the Gemara says, what can I tell you? That's not, but don't 1 minute. We teach in a Mishnah, Ein Chatas Nitzalas B'Tzamid Pasil, that the water of the paraduma that cannot be protected by the Tzamid Pasil. So that's the highest level of thing cannot be protected. Presumably, Kodesh can be protected. My love, does it not imply HaKodesh Nitzol, that Kodesh can be saved by its Tzamid Pasil? It's only the Paraduma that cannot be saved? But it says, no. It means Hamayim She'ena Mikudashim Nitzol B'Tzamid Pasil. If you have the water that you have not yet mixed the ashes in, the water you're going to use for the Chatas, but the ashes haven't yet been mixed in, then it's not sanctified fully. Then it's not at this high level, and then it will be protected. But once the ashes are moved in, it won't be protected. But that's not only something about Paraduma, it also applies to Kodesh in general. Kodesh is at such a high level, it cannot be protected with this Tzamid Pasil. And that's why there's no way to bring the Kodesh in through Eretz Ha'amim. You can't bring it in a box. You can't bring it in a pottery vessel. It won't be protected.
Tzamid Pasil means that it's sealed?
Yes, tightly sealed. Yep. So for Hamar Ula, another Ula say, Chavraya Medakin Bagalila. 1 minute, he says that the Chaverim purify their stuff in the Galilee. So now, of course, why would they be purifying it if there's no way to bring it to the base of English? It's pretty funny because Ula was a what, 200 years after Churban Abayis. So for, why are they sanctifying stuff at all? Forget whether they're in the Galilee or Judea, but okay, I don't know the answer. Anyway, the Gemara says, Minichan, anyway, you're doing, like I said, there's no Beis Hamikdash now anyway. So fine. Fine. They sanctify their stuff, but they ain't bringing it to the Beis Hamikdash. Anyway, there's no Beis Hamikdash now. They're sanctifying it, and they're leaving it some safe. And when Eliyahu Navi comes, he'll show us how to get it from the Galilee to the Beis Hamikdash without making it tamei. Okay, but basically, the leniency here, so there's two chidushim. One is that Truma Kodesh is more lenient than Truma. We've always said it's more strict. But when it comes to believing the Al Ha'aretz, it's more lenient. But this leniency is only in Judea, where they have access to the Beis Hamikdash, and there is a need in order to accept, and they can bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, and there's a need in order to accept it. When it comes to the issue of Truma, presumably by Truma, which doesn't need a Beis Hamikdash, there we believe no matter where you are, but we believe you during the period of the pressing of the oil and of the wine, of the olives and of the grapes. So the Kodesh thing is only in Judea, and that's the whole year. The Truma thing is during the pressing of the olives and the grapes, and that is presumably regardless of where you are. Okay, I guess we'll have to end here. So I keep on hoping we'll get further, but that's what
The Kufian land only